I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gunditjmara people, the traditional custodians of the land that Budj Bim National Park resides. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Budj Bim National Park was on my to-do list purely for the caves and the koalas. I had no idea about the ancient history that awaited me there. After seeing a koala within 50 metres of our campsite within an hour of arriving, my koala fix was already covered, and we planned to head off early the next morning to do the Lava Canal walk, which included Tunnel Cave, the Natural Bridge, the Crater Rim and Surprise Lake. You see, Budj Bim, also known as Mount Eccles, is a dormant volcano. It lies within the geologically defined area known as the Newer Volcanics Province, which is the youngest volcanic area in Australia and stretches from Western Victoria to southeastern South Australia. Budj Bim is the Gunditjmara name meaning high head. The roughly conical peak rises 178 metres and is what they call a scoria hill that was thrown up beside a group of 3 overlapping volcanic craters that now contain Lake Surprise. A line of smaller craters and scoria cones runs to the southeast. Lava flows extend to form a shield volcano and are fed by several lava channels, or lava canals as they are known locally. This lava flow, known as the Tirandera lava flow, changed the drainage pattern of the region and created large wetlands. Large areas to the west and southwest of the mountain have been heritage listed. The Budj Bim heritage areas include the Tirandera Indigenous Protected Area, the Budj Bim National Heritage Landscape, and the most recent being the Budj Bim Cultural Landscape, which was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019. After setting up on our first afternoon, we headed up to the now defunct Information Centre to see what we could find out about the place. At the time, I wasn't aware of this area's importance or its UNESCO listing. But in hindsight, it was odd that signs had been taken down and the Information Centre now completely empty and dark. I can only put its demise down to COVID and Victoria's harsh lockdowns over the last 2 years. After reading about the bushwalking tracks on a brochure stuck up inside the Information Centre window, we looked at a map of the vicinity and saw this. The stones, no public access. Of course we wanted to go there, right? So we decided that after our walk the following morning, we'd jump in the car and try and find the stones. A search on Google and DuckDuckGo gave us nothing further on what or where the stones were, but they did come up when we typed them into Google Maps. But more on that later. When we started the Lava Canal walk the next morning, the first thing I noticed was the dry stone walls all along the top of both sides of this so-called lava canal. My husband theorised that perhaps farmers back in the day had built them to stop cattle or sheep from entering, as the entire area around the national park is surrounded by farmland as far as the eye can see. I was happy with that theory for a little while, but as we continued to walk, the stone walls did too, and some came down into the canal and across it. Some were built almost perfectly into the side of the canal walls, and I began to be absolutely amazed by them. I'd also like to mention that as we walked for over an hour through this canal, the energy was weird. My husband agreed that it felt strange. It was very still and very quiet. Now, my husband is used to my fantastical imagination, but after me stopping to take photos and videos of stone walls for most of our walk, he was getting impatient with me to hurry it up. He, at this stage, still didn't really think anything more of them. Once we climbed up and out of the lava canal and started to walk along the top looking back in, we were able to get a closer look at the walls, and even he commented that they were very well built and looked to be very old. When we headed through the bush along the track back towards the campground and via all those other natural attractions that I did mention earlier, And you know what? The walls continued, but there were no longer any canals for them to be protecting sheep or cattle. I was totally mesmerised by these beautiful walls. I continued taking photos and videos as we continued on through the national park. After about 3.5 hours, we headed back to camp for some lunch and a bit of a rest before setting out in search of the stones. During this time, I tried to find some information on who had built all the dry stone walls in Budj Bim National Park, but everything that I found pertained only to the ancient stone aquaculture systems that the Gunditjmara people built to trap short-finned eel. Now this is incredible in itself, as it is proving that our First Nations people were not the nomadic hunter-gatherers that we were taught about in school. So the history goes that around 6,600 years ago, the Gunditjmara began transforming the landscape. They used heat to forge channels from the basalt, structuring the wetlands into a perfect habitat for short-finned eels called kuyang. Year-round eel populations and an elaborate system of traps allowed the Gunditjmara to settle and build stone houses. In all, Gunditjmara people constructed around 70 individual aquaculture systems, including channels up to 1,000 feet long. So, some of my questions were answered, but I was still astounded by the amount of these perfectly built and still standing stone walls. But as you can imagine, I was now also very interested in these stone houses too. So according to Google Maps, the stones were only a half-hour drive from our campsite. We set off at around 2 o'clock, expecting to be back in a couple of hours, but that wasn't the case at all. The tracks through the national park are pretty rough, as the entire place is literally built on the rubble of volcanic rock. So that's also what the stone walls are made out of. It's very bumpy and really slow going, but as we drove, all around us were these stone walls going in all directions. We couldn't quite fathom how all of these walls were part of the aquaculture system, especially as we were not anywhere near water whatsoever. Now, I'm not silly. I understand that over thousands of years the landscape will change, but are they saying that all of this area was water back then? And how high and deep was this water? Because some of these walls were low and others were quite high up on the edge of the lava canal. Anyway, after driving for quite some time past what I can only say are literally hundreds of kilometres of stone walls, we came across the remnants of the stone houses that I'd read about earlier in the day. I was so excited to see these incredible ancient buildings with my own eyes. Stone ruins. Ruins of the homes that the ingenious people who had also been building these intricate stone walls had also built. I was absolutely enthralled. Now they say that there are 200 registered and recorded stone house sites in Budj Bim. I saw just a few of them, but these houses were built very well, with skill. Some even had flooring and chimneys intact. My mind was blown. These people were living here permanently. These structures were engineered to perfection, as were their stone walls. We continued on through the rough terrain to see more stone walls, stone-lined holes, which I assume are part of the aquaculture systems, still in search of the stones. We got to a point where a sign told us we weren't to go any further and that we would be prosecuted if we did, and that cameras were recording us. Why, we wondered. What is so important about the stones that they would place security cameras in the middle of nowhere in the bush? Anyway, we got to where Google Maps told us the stones were, and we couldn't see anything. I walked into the bush a little bit to see if I could see anything more, but it was only more large piles of rocks that I was now accustomed to seeing everywhere in Budj Bim. After returning to the car, my husband was using Google Maps satellite imaging to try and find the stones, and it appeared that they were in an area further to the left of us that it seemed we could not get to from where we were. But look at this satellite image. I mean, what are those things? Are they ruins? Are they stones? Are they the foundations of a house? I mean, I don't know what they are. Unfortunately, at this point, it had taken us almost 3 hours to get here, and it was getting dark and starting to rain a little heavier, so we decided to abort mission and head back to camp, planning on resuming our search again the next day. But that didn't happen, as we got held up by 3 trees down on the different track that we decided to take home to avoid an extremely rocky and slow-going road. Then we got a little bit lost after taking a track that was so graciously suggested to us by Google. By the time we got back to camp, it was dark, past dinner time, and an excursion that we thought would take a couple of hours had taken over 5. Due to this and the rain the next day, with much disappointment, we decided not to resume our search for the stones. But I did wonder if perhaps these mysterious stones had anything to do with our treacherous trip home. Perhaps the stones don't want to be found, especially by 2 curious and intrepid white people. We stayed 3 nights in Budj Bim National Park, and for 2 days and 2 nights of that stay, it rained. I can only assume by the moss and lichen that covers almost everything that it rains a lot at Budj Bim. But if so, why aren't these ancient aquaculture systems still working to some degree? I mean, I understand that the eel traps at Lake Conda are still in use, but they're over 8 kilometres away as the crow flies. I found it almost impossible to believe that the stone walls all around the campground were also a part of the ancient aquaculture system. We wondered, how did they hold water? But what really made me question further was when we visited the Tamale lava blisters as we left Budj Bim. The lava blisters are 14 kilometres away from where we camped. And guess what? There are stone walls there too. Some even extending out of the lava blisters themselves. One of only 3 sites in the world where lava blisters exist. Apparently a natural phenomenon. They say these unusual circular mounds or hummocks of rock were created when the lava flow from Mount Napier spread and formed a thin crust. The accumulation of pressure beneath the crust caused it to buckle and crack, and lava oozed out, forming these unique structures. They measure up to 10 metres high and 20 metres in diameter, the size of a small house, and are located in amongst a farming region. Budj Bim left me with so many questions, and as we drove away, I knew I would never know all the answers. The history there is rich and vast, and the Gundiji Mara say the Budj Bim eel traps have been in use since the Dreaming, and throughout this time they've been rebuilt as needed. But Western science has dated the eel traps to be around 6,000 years old. Yet nobody ever seems to mention the extensive stone walling that sometimes runs for as far as the eye can see, and how much of this was lost when the British arrived and started claiming the land as their own. The British first spotted Australia in 1770, but they didn't reach Budj Bim until 1841, when government official George Augustus Robinson arrived in southwest Victoria on an exploratory expedition. Artwork from that time reveals a brushless landscape shaped by cultural burning. Descriptions reveal European racism. Robinson described the aquaculture system as resembling the work of civilised man, but noted with evident shock that on inspection he found it to be the work of the Aboriginal natives. Faced with the inconvenient fact of Aboriginal ingenuity, the British ignored it and stole their land. But in the past several decades, the Gundiji Mara have reclaimed their land and aquaculture. Now, I can't dispute what the Gundiji Mara say. They have a long-lasting oral history. But how much of that was lost for good during the Umarella Wars of the 1830s to the 1860s, when many of these people were massacred or rounded up and put into missions. They were forbidden from practicing their traditional cultural ways and ripped away from their ancestral lands. What was Budj Bim originally? Honestly, to me, at times, I felt like I was walking amongst the ruins of an ancient mining site. Mounds of rubble surrounding me, often much higher than my head, and oftentimes these immaculate dry stone walls were coming out of these mounds. And these walls, so extensive and perfectly built, looked very much like boundary lines or fences. Were the people who once lived here marking out their territory? Were they farming animals and keeping them safe in stone-built paddocks, watching over them from their stone-built houses? Or is my imagination getting the better of me, and these are the remnants of the ancient aquaculture and hydraulic engineering that our First Nations people built eons ago? Either way, this changes the trajectory of Australia's history forever. This is irrefutable evidence that our First Nations people lived a sedentary life with rich agricultural and economic lifestyles. We are lucky that this remote part of Australia was left almost untouched for 50 years more than the rest of the East Coast after the murderous British arrived, and that the Gunditjmara people fought hard to get their land back. And although having a UNESCO listing sounds prestigious, it also means that this area, which, if we're going by the mainstream historical narrative, predates the Great Wall of China by over 4,300 years, the Egyptian pyramids by 2,000 years, and Stonehenge by over 1,500 years, can no longer be explored or tested or questioned at all. It is now protected by the mainstream narrative, and to question it any further would be classed as offensive and disrespectful to our First Nations people. So the beauty and the mysteriousness that surrounds Budj Bim will always remain, and so will our curious imaginations.